Nature isn't just out there in some far-off exotic location. It's all around us, including right outside our doors. Hi, my name is Shannon Trimboli, and I am the host of Backyard Ecology. I invite you to join us as we ignite our curiosity and natural wonder, explore our yards and communities, and improve our local pollinator and wildlife habitat. Hi, everyone. Before we get started, I wanted to thank all of my supporters on Patreon. Their financial support helps cover the costs associated with hosting and producing the Backyard Ecology podcast and blog. If you would like to join them, you can find more information on the Backyard Ecology website or by searching for Backyard Ecology on the Patreon website. Today we are talking with Tristan Barley. Tristan recently received his master's degree from Miami University in Ohio and is currently a PhD student in entomology at the University of Illinois. Hi, Tristan. Welcome to Backyard Ecology. Thank you for talking with us today.
Hi, Shannon. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you about this.
Oh, yes, I'm excited too, because as our listeners know, I'm always looking for new research and information about how to create the best pollinator habitat possible. And you've been doing some work on that, especially with your master's degree. So this is going to be interesting. You had some interesting results. Some of them were kind of like big, broad picture scale, well, of course, that's the answer, which nobody ever wants to hear for the research, but it's actually one of those, oh yeah, we need to think about this more type situations, because we don't think about it as much as I think we should. But before we get into your research and talking about some of that, why don't you start off by telling us just a little bit about how you got interested in insects and pollinators?
Right. So I had a really kind of strange journey into getting into this field. My background is primarily in environmental science, and I graduated from Manchester University, kind of in northern Indiana, with a bachelor's in environmental science and biology. And I went to Miami University for my master's, kind of not really knowing what I wanted to do, just that I was interested in environmental science. I was interested in ecological work and working in the field. I really liked applied ecology. And while I was there and trying to develop a thesis, I just happened to be working as a TA for who eventually became my advisor, Dr. Jonathan Bauer. And we talked about how I was looking for an advisor and a project to do, and he kind of proposed this work looking at investigating how flower patch size can affect pollinator visitation rates. And he had done some work with pollinators before, and it seemed like a perfect intersection between kind of some general interests I had in applied ecology and more animal behavior and his background in prairie restoration work. And so I came in for a master's thesis, not really knowing exactly what I would do. And then I ended up working with bees and restored prairies, and I loved every minute of it. So it's a really strange journey. I didn't think, if you asked me 2 years before I did it what I'd be doing, I would have had no idea. I would never have guessed I was working with bees. But now that I'm working with bees, I can't think of working with anything else. And it's kind of why I'm pursuing a PhD in entomology to continue this kind of research, because I think it's very important. There's a lot of studies showing that pollinators are in a decline, and there's a lot of studies looking at honeybees as well as native bees. And I think the public doesn't think about native bees as much. We typically think about the bigger, honeybees because they're, economically important, but we don't often think about small native bees that often don't even look like bees, but are just as important for native ecosystems. And so I feel like this is really important work that I'm very passionate about now that I kind of got into it.
Yes. And it's always amazing how the twisty, curvy roads go, because I know my path definitely didn't end up being what I thought it was going to be either. It was very different. It's ended up being very different in many ways, but so much fun.
Yeah, I don't know many people that I have talked to in environmental science or ecology who knew exactly what they were going to do when they were in their undergraduate or they were working on their master's or their PhD. A lot of people take these kind of windy roads, and you never know where you're going to end up, but it's a great journey to take. And people always end up in this field. People always end up somewhere that there's just really passionate about. And for me, that happened to be bees. So it's very serendipitous, but I'm thankful for it.
Yes, exactly. I'm like you. I know very few people who are like, I'm going to do this and it's one straight road. Most of us have
Mhm,
taken lots of turns. It's a path. We like being
mhm,
outside. So it's a
mhm.
trail.
Right,
Trails are
exactly.
always curvy.
Exactly.
So you were talking about patch size. And when we think patch size, what we're talking about there is a group of plants that are all the same species are kind of clumped together.
Mhm,
A lot of us would talk about saying clumps. And the traditional advice that you hear a lot of times when planting for pollinators, especially in a garden setting where you can control where things end up a little bit more, is to plant these multiple individuals of a single species to create blocks or patches of flowers that are decent size, a 3 foot by 3 foot block at least, something where you've got multiple individuals together. And the idea has always been kind of that those patches will be more easily noticeable by pollinators
mhm,
and that the pollinators will be able to forage more efficiently because they don't have to fly so far from one flower to the other. I mean, everything's kind
mhm.
of right there next to each other. And so that would make it more attractive to pollinators. And your research was kind of looking into that and questioning that in some ways, a little bit, I would say.
Yeah. So there have been studies kind of looking at this question about whether pollinators are attracted to those larger patches of flowers, and whether they're large patches of the same flower or just large patches of different species. There's been quite a few studies that have looked at that, but a lot of studies in the past that have been done on this primarily focused on one group of pollinators, like bumblebees, since they're very big and charismatic, kind of easier to study and identify, or honeybees, since from an economics perspective, they're very valuable. But there are very few studies that look at multiple different species of flowers and look at the kind of breadth of the pollinator community visiting them, because there's lots of different things that are visiting all of these flowers. And so if you look at just one species of bee visiting a flower, just one species of flower, you're going to kind of miss the big picture because there's lots of things going on. And so, kind of in looking at that, my advisor and I, Jonathan, we worked on developing questions to see if we could investigate that further, looking at multiple flowers and then looking at all of the pollinators visiting those flowers to see if their trends were true across all flowers or if pollinators treated different flowers differently. So maybe they visit one species of flower and they prefer larger patches, but maybe another species of flower, they prefer more isolated individuals. So we kind of wanted to explore that and see if these trends were true across all pollinators for all flowers or not.
Which is a really important thing to look at because to say do this, whatever this is, for pollinators assumes that all pollinators are the same
Mhm.
and it assumes that all plants are the same and all locations are the same. And we know that's not true for any of that. But yet we all make those assumptions and make these broad scale just prescriptions so often anyway. But then you stop and think about it, it's like, wait a minute. No.
Right. And some of the studies, again, most of the studies in the past have looked at the more charismatic pollinators, so bumblebees and honeybees. And they typically found that those pollinators preferred larger patches. And so there's quite a bit of research showing that those bee groups just like larger patches. And for a lot of the reasons that you had said, that they're probably more attractive, they're easier to spot, it's easier to communicate with the rest of the hive where those patches are. There's a big patch, and we can bring lots of other bees to help collect all the floral resources here. And it's less flight time between each flower. And so that all makes sense. But there have been some studies, a few, that have looked at smaller native bees. So, like metallic sweat bees, and the genus for that would be like Ogochlorella. And there's various species of that. They're just these tiny little, smaller than a housefly at times, little metallic green bee. Most people wouldn't even think it was a bee unless you actually looked really closely. And there have been studies that have found that they prefer to visit smaller patches, more isolated flowers, but there haven't been a lot of those because we tend to focus on the more charismatic pollinators. And so we miss the whole picture when we don't look at all of the native pollinators. We don't look at all of those tiny bees that are maybe harder to study because they're harder to identify. They're harder to notice. Most people don't think about them because most people, when they see them, don't think they see a bee. They don't know what they see. It's just a generic flying insect, but it's actually a very important pollinator for native ecosystems. And so it is important to think about how we can't just apply one treatment and just assume it will always work. Nature is just more complicated than that.
Yeah. The common answer is when you really dig into stuff is it depends when it comes to ecology and anything with nature and stuff. So again, this is one of those it depends questions. But yeah, I love those native bees, those little sweat bees, the green metallic ones. Oh my gosh, they're so gorgeous, some of them.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I never paid any attention to them for a very long time. And now I'm always like, ooh, what's that one? What's that one? And there's like a whole group of bees that I just very generically call the gnat-sized bees because they are the size of a gnat. And like you said, unless you're really paying attention, you're not going to think of them as a bee. And I'm not good enough with my native bees to, when they're flying around real fast and buzzing here and there and going into stems, if I've just cut the stems so that they can go in for nesting habit, I can't, without catching them and looking at them, say, oh yeah, that's a da la 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 la. So I've generically just classified them a lot of times as gnat-sized bees, but they're so much fun to watch.
They are. And in part of this research, I had to, me and an REU student who worked with me during that summer and is an author on the paper, Michael Martinez, he and I spent a long time outside watching our flowers that we had marked to observe and see what visited them and to record everything that visited them. And we truly spent hours and hours out there just staring at flowers and watching bees work. And it's one of the most fascinating things you can actually do. And especially is how differently they act. A bumblebee comes to a flower and it just throws itself in there and it just, it might take up the entire flower and, vibrate its abdomen and wings to actually get the pollen out. Whereas you get these tiny little bees that, again, usually go unnoticed and they're very meticulous in how they go in because they're just so small. And, it's fascinating to watch them work. It's actually, if you ever get a chance to do it, I recommend everyone should do it just because it's a way the world works that a lot of people don't see and appreciate. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. You'll always be thinking about those little bees and you'll see them everywhere. Then you notice that they are everywhere.
Yes, exactly. And that's pretty much how I got into it too, I'm a beekeeper as well. And I started watching my honeybees on the flowers. And then as a wildlife biologist and a naturalist, I'm like, oh, that bee's kind of cool. Of course, start out seeing the bumblebees and the carpenter bees the most. And then you start seeing oh, wait a minute, that's bright green. That one's pretty cool. Start learning the metallic sweat bees. And then as the more you start watching, it's like, ooh, 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 ooh. And you see the little teeny tiny things that you never even noticed before. And it's just amazing to watch.
It is. And we're talking about bees, and they're not even the only pollinators. It's not even getting into the different species of flies that pollinate as well. You have hoverflies that mimic bees, and a lot of people would see them and just see yellow and black and think they're a bee, but they're not. They're just a fly that is pretending to be a bee, and they'll visit flowers too. And so watching flowers is one of the most rewarding things you can actually do.
Yes, exactly. I mean, you've got the flies, you've got beetles, you've got ants. I mean, there's just so many different things that come to the flowers. And then of course you've got the wasps. And we're not even talking about those right now. And the butterflies and then the hummingbirds and it just keeps going.
Right. And part of this research was a lot of people focus on very specific groups, bumblebees and honeybees. And there's a lot of things out there pollinating flowers and visiting flowers and that are important to the ecology propagation of these flowers. And so big part of this research was looking at everything else that tends to go unnoticed.
Which is one of the things I thought was so cool and so interesting about your work was because you did look at everything and really spend that time looking at the flowers and trying to figure out what was coming to them and how that varied between three different groups of flowers.
Well, I don't think we did everything. in science, definitely.
Well,
I
yeah,
learned,
not everything.
yeah, I learned this. One of the things I learned after this project was you can never do everything you want.
Mm-mm.
I very much, when I started this project, my advisor and I were working on what flowers we would target and how many flowers to target, creating our methods. And I went very over the top. I was like, I can do it all. I'm going to look at all these different things. And then it doesn't really dawn on you how much 150 flowers is until you're out there and you've marked 150 flowers and you realize that you have to watch each of them for 5 minutes and they're spread across a prairie and you have to record all the flowers around them and you have to watch all of them for 5 minutes to see what comes by. And then you have to come back and watch them again. And then you have to come back and collect seeds. And all of a sudden, that's just one flower species. And it becomes a lot of work really quickly. And so it's funny, you can always do more. And even with this study, I've always thought there was more I could do, but time is never on your side with science. But I was really happy with what we did get to do. And we saw some really cool things with what we were able to do.
So, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about kind of the flowers you were looking at, what you were looking at with them, and kind of introduce us a little bit to what you were doing?
Yeah. So this research took place in a restored prairie. It was actually one of the professors on my committee for my master's thesis manages the land and helped restore it from agriculture and takes care of it. And so it was 11 acres of restored prairie and it's very beautiful land. And he had a great seed mix of lots of different native flowers, and there was a lot of variety of habitat around it. There were wetlands, there was nearby forests, there's plenty of different habitat for native bees to be present. And so we targeted 3 flower species for this study. The first is Penstemon digitalis, which is also called beard tongue. It's this kind of white tube-like flower. It's very pretty and it blooms kind of early in the summer, late spring. The second is Monarda fistulosa or bee balm. It kind of has these longer, like a sprout of purple tube-like flowers. It's very attractive to bees and it tends to bloom more in kind of midsummer. And then the last one was Eryngium yuccifolium, which is also called rattlesnake master, which is objectively the best name any plant could ever have.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, definitely the best. And it blooms later in the summer. It has these kind of almost cone-like, they're like almost like tiny little spiky balls that have lots of little flowers on them. They're really cool. And so we picked these flowers in no small part because of their bloom times. So they didn't overlap in bloom times. So we could focus on just penstemon. And when penstemon was done blooming, we could focus on just monarda. And with these flowers, we went out, Michael and I, the REU student who worked with me over the summer, we went out and we marked all of the flowers we intended to use. And those flowers that we marked, we would come back and do pollinator observations. And so to kind of record density and see how big the patches were, we kept track of how many flowers were around those flowers that we marked to just see different patch sizes. And we didn't actually do any manipulation. So we didn't plant any of these intentionally. We didn't take away, like cut down any flowers to make smaller patches. So this is a completely natural setting, which is part of what made it really cool because it was truly applied work. This is a natural system that we've just unaltered and we're making observations on. And so the flowers that we marked, we would come by and we would watch them for 5 minutes. And we would just record any bees or pollinators that came by and like actually visited the flowers on it. And we kept track of plant characteristics such as height and how many flowers were on the plant to kind of control for that in our data and when we actually ran statistics on it. And we did this for Monarda and Penstemon, we did it twice. So we had 2 rounds of 5-minute observations for 10 minutes total per individual. And then for Eryngium, we did it 3 times. So we had 15 minutes per individual flower we were watching for pollinators. And so we recorded any pollinators that came, but it was really hard to get them down to species because a bumblebee, any kind of bee on the wing is difficult to identify. You really need to be able to look at it under a microscope, especially for the smaller native bees. And so after we were done with our observations, we went out and we collected bees with nets and tiny little aspirators to kind of suck them up. And we would take them back to the lab and just kind of see what was in the community, characterize what species were in the area and visiting our flowers. And In addition to that, for Eryngium, because we were also interested in the effects this would have on plants. Are isolated plants actually producing less seeds than plants in bigger patches? Because if we think that isolated plants aren't being visited as much, it would probably make sense that they maybe aren't producing as many seeds because they're not actually reproducing as much, they're not propagating because they're not having those bees bring pollen from other plants. And so for Eryngium, we actually collected seeds. So we just cut off the bulbs of the flowers and then we pulled out the seeds and did a dry weight of them and just weighed them to see if there was a difference. And so that kind of in a nutshell is what we did. And we did that over the whole summer, spending a lot of time in prairies. So we stared at Penstemon digitalis, the two of us, for 25 hours total, 8.5 hours for Monarda fistulosa, and then 38 hours for Eryngium. So between the two of us, we were out there for many, many hours just staring at flowers and recording everything that came. So it was a really cool experience, actually. I loved it a lot.
Yes, that would be fun. And like you said, that's a lot of time spent just staring at flowers, trying to figure out what all's visiting them. And I'm assuming we're saying pollinators, but really we're talking flower visitors more than pollinators, because you weren't actually going in and saying, okay, did it touch the right parts to the right parts and actually transfer pollen, which is what pollination is. But I mean, we often use pollinators as kind of that generic flower visitor terminology.
Right, that is correct. We didn't actually see how effective the visitors were. And there's lots of research that shows that the things that visit flowers aren't all the same. So, for example, like a bumblebee is really good at pollinating typically, but a moth might not be as good. And we didn't really consider that. We just considered what was visiting the flowers. And so the effectiveness of the pollinators wasn't quite as important to our research, but it was something that would be interesting to follow up on for sure.
And something can be a pollinator, but not a pollinator of the plant that it visits. So, yeah, I mean, pollinators is still works for it. We're just talking big picture, not little minute detail with it.
Right.
So you were looking at pretty much everything that came. Were there any kind of generalities? Like, I believe mostly bees was what you found, but you found some other things as well.
Right. So we focused mainly on bees, and there was tons of different things that came, and they were kind of what was easiest for us to kind of break down and identify. And, bees are very important pollinators, so that makes sense. But we did find a lot of different things. We mentioned earlier that, we didn't even talk about wasps. Well, there was tons of wasps, especially for Eryngium, the rattlesnake master. There was plenty of wasps that visited. There were different beetles. We found ants occasionally as well. Butterflies and moths would come and go. There was lots of different things. And one of the most fascinating things was kind of in line with not really thinking about the actual, like what a bee is, not thinking about the tiny little bees that we don't observe and don't think about that much. We don't think about how much actually visits flowers until you actually look at a flower and see lots of different things visiting it. And so it was definitely surprising for me. And it was my first exposure to really just staring at a flower and seeing the diversity of life that will visit them. And actually, one of the coolest things was, especially for Eryngium, I remember doing my observations, and in this one patch, there was a lot of ambush bugs, which are these kind of predaceous true bugs that hide kind of on the flower, under the flower, just kind of near the flower, and they will grab things that come by, prey on them. And so it was one of the coolest things was I would do these observations, and on the underside of the flower, like above it, you'd have all these things visiting. And on the underside of the flower, there'd be this tiny little ambush bug that's not much bigger than the bees that it was eating. And it would just be eating a very tiny metallic green bee, while above it, there was tons of things visiting the flower. And they had no idea how lucky they were not to be dinner.
Oh, yes. The flowers always have such a great ecosystem if we just stop and look. And
it's like its own little world in a lot of ways.
Definitely it is. And then, oh my gosh, the robber flies. I love watching the robber flies. And so often they'll look like a wasp or they'll look like a bee, And then all of a sudden you hear this big loud buzz. And at certain times of the year, I know the big loud buzz, look for robber fly because they just have this certain buzz to them. And all of a sudden you'll find a robber fly that's just taken off and grabbed something and it's sitting there eating a bee or whatever. Well, like I said, all the other pollinators are sitting there going about their business. And it's like, oh, okay.
Yeah, it's just a cool little world to get lost in. The more you look, the more you see all
Mm-hmm.
the time.
Yes. And the goldenrod crab spiders on the goldenrods during the fall. But oh,
Mm,
yes, there's so many things that you can look for. Then when you, like you said, start staring at the flowers. And we might want to point out too, because I know rattlesnake master, the iridium, it is a really good flower for including in pollinator gardens and stuff like that and prairie plantings. It's such an amazing little flower. And it's really starting to become more popular with a lot of people. But some people get afraid of wasps. And I know I used to be that way too. And I don't want it to scare anybody off when we say the wasps are really going for the rattlesnake master. The wasps that we're talking about are not the big scary ones. A lot of times these are itty bitty, teeny tiny things that you would never think was a wasp unless you really stared and looked at it. A lot of the little wasps, just like the little bees, are what's going to the rattlesnake master.
And especially even any bigger wasps are typically not interested in people. They are not very aggressive. The wasps that we were seeing were not the big hornets that are really, scare people. These were smaller paper wasps that were black and had really long waists, long-waisted black wasps, and they aren't really interested in attacking people or swarming or anything like that. They just visit flowers.
Mhm.
That's more what they're concerned with.
Exactly. I mean, any of the wasps, when they're on the flowers, as long as you don't do something stupid and try and grab them or
That
something
applies
like
to that
that.
applies to bumblebees too, though, or honeybees.
Exactly. It's the same as with any bee. Don't do stupid things, and you're usually pretty good with the ones that are on the flowers. They're just out to dinner.
They can also be quite valuable. Having wasps is just a form of pest control. If you really want to if you maintain the plants that you put out in your native garden, having wasps is one of the best ways to actually keep anything from destroying them. And so that can be very valuable for that.
Yes, that's what I was about to say too, is that a lot of these wasps, especially when you start talking about those long-waisted wasps, you're getting into the parasitoids, and those are so important for natural pest control
Definitely.
and are such valuable parts of our garden ecosystems and our prairie natural ecosystems.
Exactly.
So, what were your results? What did you find after spending 100 hours by the time you add it all up out there staring at flowers?
So our results were really interesting and in some ways a little unexpected. So we found when we looked at all of our pollinators, so just we didn't break them down by identity. We just looked at all of the pollinators that visited our three flowers, and we wanted to see if they preferred larger patches or more isolated flowers. And when we looked at all the pollinators, we didn't actually see an effect. They didn't seem to have a preference at all. And there were kind of some trends that we saw, like our data was not significant, but it was marginally insignificant. And so I talked to my advisor about it, and it warranted kind of digging a little deeper because it seemed like there was something going on. And so I dug a little deeper into it and started breaking pollinators down by their identity. So the different groups of bees, and I would kind of lump bigger groups together. So there's many different species of bumblebee, but I just lumped them all together as bumblebees, for example. And when we did this, or when I did this, I found there's some really kind of cool things going on. So the different groups of bees actually did have a preference as to what patches they were visiting. So, for example, bumblebees tended to visit larger patches more often, which previous studies had found and made sense. But smaller bees, so those kind of smaller sweat bees, metallic sweat bees that we were talking about, or Serentina bees, that would be the genus. Serentina is a genus of small carpenter bees. They're this like bluish gray bee, and they'd be what you would call one of the gnat bees. They actually had very different visitation patterns depending on what they were visiting. So it seemed the identity of the flower was important to their actual overall visitation pattern, whether they were visiting large patches more often than smaller patches. So bumblebees tended to prefer the larger patches, but those smaller, more metallic bees in a lot of instances would prefer more isolated flowers. And so we thought, kind of looking at that, that they might be avoiding the larger bumblebees. Since the bumblebees, they're bigger and they are able to, signal a big patch and recruit other bees or other individuals in their hive to a flower patch, they probably use up or take more of the flower resources more quickly than the smaller metallic sweat bees could actually, or Serentina bees could actually get the resources. And so it might be advantageous for them to visit those more isolated flowers. But with Eryngium was really, really interesting for this work because bumblebees did not visit Eryngium that much. We had some visitors, but it was not a big visiting pollinator group. And these tiny little bees, when they weren't competing with bumblebees, preferred the larger patches. So it seems that when they were visiting flowers that the bumblebees weren't visiting, they might actually prefer the larger patches because for all the reasons we had said earlier, it makes more sense because there's more flowers there. You don't have to fly as far to visit another flower and get more resources. It's easier to see. And so it seems that bees do prefer that, but those smaller bees, they might be competing with bumblebees. At least that's what we kind of thought when we were looking at this. And so it's really interesting to see because it showed that, kind of like we said before, there isn't just one general thing that works for everything. All the bees that we kind of looked at were very different, and the flowers also had an impact. So what was visiting the flowers could have been important, or just the flower itself could have been important. So you can't look and just assume all pollinators are going to prefer larger patches of flowers because that's not true. It depends on the flower. It depends on what else is visiting that flower, what else is in the actual community, the flowering community. So it was really cool to see, especially kind of in the context of what previous work had found. And then kind of to spin off from that, one of the interesting things to kind of mention Eryngium again, and kind of that we looked at seeds in Eryngium, is that we did find that the isolated flowers actually had greater seed weight than those in larger patches. And so kind of what that means is that the flowers that were isolated were producing more seeds than those that were in larger patches. And so from the perspective of the flowers, it seems, at least for Eryngium, that maybe being isolated was advantageous because maybe you were more likely to actually be visited by a pollinator that had pollen that you could actually propagate with. Whereas in a larger patch of flowers, maybe you were competing for resources as well. So the bees are competing for flower resources, but the flowers are also competing for pollen. They're trying to reproduce. And so maybe you were less likely to be visited and actually be visited by something that had pollen that actually pollinated you properly. And so that was kind of interesting too. So as we had kind of talked about, that it's like this own little ecosystem. There's a lot of things going on when you actually stop and look at flowers and what visits them. There's a lot of interactions going on. There's a lot of things competing for resources, whether that be nectar and pollen or pollen to reproduce with. It's all a very complex interaction. And it seems that we can't just simplify it. We can't say that one thing applies to all of these flowers or applies to visitation for all bees. There's more to it than just that.
Yes. And the whole thing with the seed set was really interesting to me too, because I know I'm as guilty as anybody else of doing this, but many of us tend to focus on the animal side of things. So in this case, the pollinator side of things. And we forget that, okay, the plant's not just out there putting out pollen for the fun of it or putting out nectar just to help the bees or help the butterflies or help the pollinators. It's got its own needs that it's trying to have accomplished as well. So yeah, looking at it from the plant side and how the isolation versus the patch size was also really interesting to me.
Mm-hmm. And I think it could definitely be interesting if you are looking at it from maybe a land management perspective.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, for Eryngium, based on kind of our results, if you were looking to produce a lot of Eryngium seeds, maybe you want to actually collect seeds so you can plant them elsewhere, or maybe you just want the population on its own to be really healthy and to kind of spread, and you are interested in having a big, healthy Eryngium population in your land. maybe putting them all in a big patch or just many big patches maybe won't produce as many seeds as if you have them kind of in some big patches and some small patches and you spread them out in different ways and have a more complex landscape. And that seems to maybe be more beneficial to the Eryngium community. It might allow more seeds to be created and actually help you achieve that if that's what you're actually looking to do.
Yes. And it's always fun and helpful to not just have okay, this is what we found, but also be able to find those ways that we can apply. Because like you said, you're interested in applied ecology. That's what I've become interested in, is a lot of applied ecology, because I want to figure out how to make it work. I love the behavior. I really do. And that still fascinates me, always will. But then it's like, okay, now how do I make this work in the real world, and how do I apply it?
Right. And so part of it, again, from like a land management perspective, is looking at things like that. So looking at the behavior of these bees or looking at the seed production and using that to help, at least in my opinion, it's fascinating to use that kind of data to help determine how you can make your lands more diverse and kind of encourage these diverse pollinating communities, these diverse bee communities, these healthy plant communities. If you're very interested in having a healthy, diverse native bee community on your land, planting one kind of flower in a big patch might actually exclude some things. You might have a ton of bumblebees, and if you just want bumblebees, that's great. But if you want a really diverse and healthy native bee community, it might be better to have some big patches and some small patches so that bumblebees are visiting the larger patches, and that leaves resources for the smaller bees, the smaller metallic sweat bees, to visit. And then you allow all of these different groups to kind of coexist. Whereas if you have just one big patch, maybe that coexistence isn't possible.
And then for people who have smaller properties, hearing this is really also nice, because it means that, okay, if you don't have the space to do kind of these generic plant these big blocks and patches type idea, it's okay. You might be helping out some of the little bees, some of the little native bees that often get overlooked more than you're helping out the bumblebees. That's perfectly okay too. Now, you still probably don't want to plant just one of one species, a single individual. You're not going to get good seed set a lot of times for that. It's still going to be hard to attract things to it. But still, having a couple of these, you don't have to worry about having as big of a block if that doesn't work with your property.
Right. And even if you have smaller patches and, smaller, more isolated patches, just having a diversity of flowers, kind of as you mentioned, could still, really help a lot of those native bees. Kind of going back to my research, where bumblebees didn't really visit Eryngium that much. So just by having a diversity of flowers, maybe, bumblebees still will visit those isolated flowers that they find attractive, but you also are still providing resources for those smaller bees, because if the bumblebees don't particularly care about the Eryngium, they're not visiting it as much as other flowers, the smaller bees seem to be taking advantage of that and targeting flowers that they know maybe aren't being visited. They're not competing with bumblebees when they visit Eryngium. So you actually can still kind of allow, in a way, you can really help native bees and kind of foster a good community, even if you don't have a lot of land to make a big, spectacular restored prairie.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, again, we're really focusing on bees here, and all three of the species that you picked are primarily bee pollinated flowers, or bee and wasp pollinated flowers, but mainly bee pollinated flowers. And then you have all the ones that are going to be more attractive to, say, your beetles or your butterflies. I mean, that's what a lot of people are interested as well. It's the butterflies. So having that diversity is really going to help that as well, and bring in all those different types of pollinators.
Right. And any natural ecosystem is healthy when it is more diverse. Any kind of just monoculture, just having one thing, isn't going to produce that healthy of an ecosystem, because you'll have just one group of things visiting the flowers. You'd have very selective amounts of things living on the flowers, but having a diversity creates it creates that little world. It creates that complex little community that we've kind of been talking about. And that's only possible through a diversity of plants. You provide a diversity of plants and the pollinators will come, be they bees or wasps or beetles. If you plant it, they will come.
Which is always fun. And then you just have to spend more time staring at flowers so that you can see what else is coming.
But that's a win-win, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So what are some of the other fun things that you saw as you were spending all these hours out there watching?
Well, my professor, Hayes Cummins, who owned the land, he tried to encourage a diverse community of things. And so he had lots of bird boxes. And I definitely got dive bombed quite a few times as I'm walking around flowers and I heard something whistle over my head and I was like, what in the world was that? And I just was dumbfounded in the middle of this prairie by myself in like 90-degree heat. And then I look up and see this tiny little bluebird just dive bombing me. And like I had to duck and run. It's very easy to get lost in the prairie. And it's its own little world. It's very easy to get lost out there and just get sucked in and get sidetracked. And I may have gotten sidetracked with some birds more than I would care to admit.
Well, see, I love the birds too. So I'm always getting sidetracked watching the birds and it's just fun. I mean, that's one of the things about, for me, why I was always interested in wildlife biology is I was just always interested in nature. Mm-hmm. So it's interested in this and then that leads me to watch this and then, oh, look, there's something over there. And yeah, I love it all. So I'm always going from birds to flowers to butterflies and bees and then just all the way back out again and looking at it all.
Yeah, one of the best things I like about it, things you don't see, oftentimes, especially in tall prairies with tall grasses and flowers, you're kind of just sneaking through and you can't really see what's out there. And then all of a sudden, you'll just hear something really big just run. And then a deer pops up and is gone and you just freeze. And you're like, that was really close. You're like, I was 10 feet away from it and had no idea because it was just sitting there so silently. Or especially because there were wetlands and there were forests on this property. And so I remember being by a wetland and all of a sudden I heard something really big and then I saw something like slink into the water. And it was just fascinating because I just stared at it and I was hoping it would come out and it never did. And I was like, oh, what was that? I don't know. And I'm completely sidetracked. I'm like, I'm supposed to be looking at flowers, but I can't because I want to see what just went into the water. I have no idea.
Exactly. But I mean, that's part of being in this field.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you are in this field professionally or just in this field as a hobby and loving to go out and enjoy the birds or enjoy the pollinators and the flowers and just hike and enjoy and appreciate it. That's all part of it.
The secret is even the people who are in it professionally, it's a hobby to us too.
Shh, don't tell everybody. Yes. Oh, yes, exactly.
We're just being paid to go look at flowers.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I've been on more than one bird field trip where we're supposed to be looking at birds and we spend half the time looking at flowers. And on more than one botany field trip, we're supposed to be looking at flowers where we spend half the time looking at birds. I mean, we do it all the time. Everybody does it at every level.
But again, it's a win-win.
Yes, exactly. Well, this has been really interesting. And I think your research with pollinators and really looking at the different groups of pollinators, especially the different types of bees, and how really reinforcing that idea that we sometimes forget about, that we can't just do a one-size-fits-all prescription. It really does depend. And then you have the effects of how the plants are spread out and the block sizes or the patch sizes on the plants themselves. And thinking about that, I mean, that's all really important stuff that we need to think about more. And that does have applications for wildlife managers and habitat managers at a large scale, as well as potentially individual homeowners, whether they're working in larger plots or just small garden settings. There's a lot of interesting stuff here.
Right. And it's all very important stuff because pollinators are declining and there is a lot of interest in creating these spaces for pollinators to exist and protecting pollinator habitat. Especially my research was in Ohio and I'm currently at the University of Illinois. So all of my research on this has been in the Midwest. And in the Midwest, historically, there was acres and acres and acres of prairie. A lot of the Midwest is prairie or oak savanna, which allowed these great abundances of these native flowers. And it created all of this habitat for these native bees. And we have largely destroyed a lot of it. There's very little remnant prairie left, especially in the Midwest. There's very little of it left. And what remnant prairie there is, so prairie that we haven't touched, we haven't destroyed, it's just always existed like that. It's very rare, and what's left is typically very, very small. And so, in order to create these spaces for native pollinators and native bees and make sure that they have habitat, we really need to have native gardens in our backyards. We need to take big plots of land and restore them. We need to plant these native flowers and say, we're going to protect this land, we're going to take care of it, and we're going to let it have that kind of diversity. We're going to let it be diverse, and we're going to let it foster these diverse native communities of flowers and bees. And that's healthy and that's good. And we need to do that. And so everyone is capable of doing that in any way, whether you have a lot of land and you can protect a lot of land and provide a really big refuge for these native plants and pollinators, or even if it's just in your backyard and you have a bed of flowers that bees will visit, and that's still helping a small community of bees in its own way. It's all important, and we can all help with that. And using kind of data like this and kind of research like this, I like to think at least, can help inform us on how best to do that.
Yes, I agree. And it's not just the Midwest either that used to have a lot more prairies than they did.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, goes through much of the East. I mean, the Southeast, I'm in Kentucky, and it's the same story.
Mm-hmm.
Keep going further south. And again, you get into it even more, where you had those savannas, the oak savannas, the pine savannas. And like you said, that diversity, we can all do a little bit with it, and we can all help.
I think, especially recently, there's been a lot of understanding, not just in the United States, but kind of across the world, that we really have done a lot to damage the planet, and we've destroyed a lot of habitat. And one of the biggest reasons that species are declining is because of habitat loss. And that includes native bees and pollinators and native flowers. And I think that we've become a lot more conscious of that, especially now. And now we are very conscious of it. And I think a lot of people are starting to plant more native things and actually try to provide what habitat we can. We're starting to shift away from having conventional, turf grass lawns with ornamental plants that native pollinators don't care about. We're starting to plant more native flowers and plant more native grasses and go away from that. Just in my neighborhood alone, there's many houses that have tons of native plants. Like instead of a bed of roses, they have gray-headed coneflower and monarda. And that's great because native bees love that. And so any little bit helps. And if everyone steps in and starts planting native things, native pollinators will come, and we can start restoring that habitat and be more aware as a society that our actions matter, and we need to kind of stop this habitat loss, and we need to stop this loss of biodiversity because it's not good for the planet, it's not healthy, and we can do a lot better. And it's not hard to fix. We just need to be more conscious of how we treat the land and what we're planting.
Yes. Well, like I said, this has been interesting. So if people have questions, can they contact you?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes. And also, I did send you some links if people are interested. The two labs. So the one lab was the lab I was in. Jonathan does a lot of prairie restoration work. And the lab I'm currently in does a lot of work with honeybees. And I work with native bees as well, native bees and honeybees. And there's a postdoc in the lab who's worked with native bees too. So if people are interested in looking at research like that, they can check out the lab pages and see what kind of work is being done.
Yes, I will definitely have links to your current lab, your former lab, and to your research paper in the show notes. And I can put your email address so that people can contact you if they've got questions for you directly. But yes, I always recommend people going and checking out all the research that's going on because there's so much happening and we're always learning. And sometimes we're learning new questions to ask.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we're learning, oh, maybe things didn't quite work the way we thought they worked, and fine-tuning some of our knowledge and building upon what other people have learned. And I mean, that's part of science. And it's always fun and interesting to see what's going on there.
Right. And I think most people will find that the people like me who do this kind of research always want to talk about the research and are always interested in talking about their papers and what it means and what they found interesting or what confused them. It's all part of the fun. That's why we do this. People like me really love what we do, and so we love to talk about it. And so you can always reach out and chat. We love to talk science. So that's what we're here for.
Yes. Thanks again for talking with us today.
Thank you for having me. I loved talking about the research and talking about how people could use it to just be better stewards of the land. And I hope people do.
Yes.
We all have a role to play in this.
Yes, I think they will. But yes, thank you again so much. Have a great day.
Yeah, you as well. Thank you.
All right. Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye.
I appreciate Tristan taking time to talk with us today. So often we fall into the trap of talking about pollinators as if they are all the same. This is especially true when we are talking about pollinator gardens, pollinator plantings, or creating pollinator habitat. However, Tristan's research is a good reminder of how doing so ignores the fact that the needs of our pollinators are as diverse as our pollinators and the plants that they rely on. In some ways, that can be frustrating because it means that there isn't an easy answer to questions like, what and how should I plant for pollinators? Let's face it, none of us particularly like the answer, it depends, no matter how truthful that answer is. However, that knowledge is also freeing because it means that we aren't locked into one specific way of doing things. It gives us choices and options for how to manage our own properties for pollinators, or at least how to manage for different types of pollinators. Yet, even though there isn't one set answer for how to manage your property for pollinators, or how and what to plant for pollinators, that doesn't mean that anything goes or that there aren't any answers. There are trends and commonalities between different types of pollinators. In the case of Tristan's research, that was seen in the patch size preferences between the larger bumblebees and the tiny metallic green sweat bees and Serratina bees. So we can say things like, if you want to encourage this type of pollinator on your property, then you need to think about doing these types of things. Or, given these conditions and limitations that you have on your property, you might be able to make a bigger impact by focusing your activities on these types of pollinators. We just have to be careful about how broadly we use the term pollinators and how many different types of animals we are lumping together in that term at the same time. In the end, Tristan's advice to have a diverse range of plants and patch sizes for each type of plant is the best general advice possible for planting and managing your land for all types of pollinators, because that is going to have the best chance of allowing all the different types of pollinators the opportunity to have their specific needs and preferences met. And like Tristan said, we can all do something to help out. I also wholeheartedly second Tristan's recommendation to take some time to stare at a flower and just be amazed at all the different animals that visit the flower and all the different things happening on that flower. I'll warn you though, staring at flowers can be addicting and can lead you down a never-ending rabbit hole of trying to figure out what that cool-looking bug is, or what in the world is that thing doing. I can think of worse ways to spend an afternoon or a few hours in the morning, though. Before I wrap this up, I want to ask a favor of you. If you find value in the Backyard Ecology content, please consider joining our community of supporters. There are many ways you can support Backyard Ecology, both financially and non-financially. Learn more at www.backyardecology.net/join-us. Until next week, I encourage you to take some time to enjoy the nature in your own yard and community.